Hello everyone. This is Abhijit Dasgupta. Hello everyone. This is Abhijit Dasgupta from 366 SkyPiCast and welcome to another session of FLO Blockchain App Development by SkyPiCast. We will be having these live online sessions till 15th of September 2018 every Tuesday, Thursday and Saturdays at 9 p.m. IST. So don't forget to tune into all of those to continue in this journey of apps development on FLO Blockchain with us. We would like to thank Ranchi Mall for their continued support in our blockchain journey. We would also like to thank the entire FLO community and its dev team for all the support. In this session, we will continue building the web application on C#.NET for creating a FLO blockchain-based business card, which we started in our previous session. Using this application, people can create business cards by entering their details, and the data is then stored in FLO blockchain. So let's do a quick recap of what we discussed in the previous session. In our previous session, we set up the project in Visual Studio IDE and created the data entry UI using the Bootstrap framework of HTML. In today's session, we are going to be continuing with that exact project. And since we mentioned that in our previous session also, that we are going to be dividing this app development into 3 sessions, and today is the second session. What we are going to take up on this session is we are going to be creating the flow data or the metadata that needs to go into blockchain for this particular B-card app. We are going to be creating that using the UI that we created in our previous session. We are then going to be performing the transaction to the FLO blockchain using this data and capturing the transaction ID. I would also like to mention that for this purpose, like for transacting with the blockchain, we are going to be using the API that we developed in some of our previous sessions. So we are going to leverage that API that we created, and using that API, we are going to be calling those transactions into FLO. Let's just run down through the app design approach that we discussed in our previous session also. Let's just have a recap of that. The approach for this particular app that we are going to be creating for the visiting card is where the user comes into our application, he gets a form, he enters his details, and once that details are entered, he clicks on the submit button. Once the submit button is clicked, all the data that he has entered gets created as a flow data as per a fixed format that we are going to be deciding after a few slides. Once that data has been prepared, we are going to perform a transaction and push the data to blockchain. Once the data has been pushed to blockchain, we will be getting a transaction ID for that transaction. We are going to capture that particular transaction ID and use that transaction ID to populate the business card with the data that has gone to the blockchain. So we can do that anytime we want. We will create a particular URL and possibly a QR code of that URL, which can be shared with anyone, and whenever they come to that URL, they will have the data populated with the data as saved in the blockchain for your B card. So that is something that we plan on doing. In this particular session, we said that we are going to be pushing the data to the FLO blockchain in form of the flow data. So the B card application, it will use a format which we are going to be deciding. So we can use any type of format. This entire data format that you are going to push into the flow data of FLO blockchain, it is entirely up to you what type of format you are using. For this particular demonstration purpose, I am using this particular format that you are seeing on screen. What I am going to do here is I am going to be starting the flow data with my application identifier, which I might use as say for example 366 flow card or B card. So that will be my application identifier, which I can later use. If you remember, we also developed one flow scan or flow search data tool, wherein we could add these application identifiers, and it will scan the entire FLO blockchain and find out transactions with these identifiers in flow data among them. So this is something that I generally use. wherein I use one application identifier so that I can find out my transactions in the flow data in the entire blockchain. So we are going to be adding one application identifier. The separator that I'm going to be using to segregate all the data in this entire string is going to be the hash symbol. You can use any type of special symbol or any symbol which you are not going to be using for your data as per se. So that those symbols that you are going to be choosing as a separator, you need to make sure that you are not using that in any of your data values actually. So in my case, I'm using this hash character to separate my application identifier with the name with the organization with designation, and all the different parameters. So once this data comes to me from the FLO blockchain, I can just split this data using the separator that I'm using, and I will have the data available in form of an object or in form of different parameters. So that is something that we will be doing. So let's just start with the development or continue with the development of that app. So let me just stop this slideshow and go to Visual Studio. So if you see, I have started the Flow web service that we created a few days back. And if you see, this is running and I'm just calling the get info API that we have. And it is pretty much giving me all the outputs from the blockchain that we have. And for this purpose, I am running this API on a local host. You can have this hosted on any server if you have. And for that purpose, I am also running this Flow Core wallet, which is actually receiving the data from which are actually communicating with my API. So for this particular API to work, you need to have the wallet running. And for this particular application, we are going to just leverage this entire API. So let's just keep this particular API definition page handy so that we can just know which type of APIs we can use and what type of request they need. So let's just go ahead and open the FLO business card app that we started creating. If you remember, in our previous session, we started with the UI part of it, and we created the entire UI for this particular FLO card form using the Bootstrap framework, Twitter Bootstrap framework, which is a HTML framework for creating nice looking UIs very easily. So let's just open this application and let's just refresh on how the UI looked and what we are going to do next. So I've just started this application using the build and preview button. So let's just give it a few seconds. It should just compile and start the application. Okay, so as you see, the browser window has opened in Google Chrome, and now it is just going to redirect us to the page that we declared, or the page that we designed. If you remember, in the form that we designed, we pretty much took some basic information that we want in our business card to have, like the name, the designation, the organization that you work for, your email ID, your phone number. And if you remember, for your photo to come into the business card, in this particular iteration of the application that we are doing, we are asking the user to enter a URL that is available publicly over the internet for their profile pic, which they can use from their Twitter or any other place wherever they have that particular image URL available. So this is the FLO business card form that we created, that we designed. So this is something that is already done. We have already named our inputs with whatever we required. So let's just go ahead and start or continue with the development. For this, what we are going to do here is, the first thing that we will be doing here is, we will be capturing the inputs that this form has and getting them into our backend code. So this is the backend code, or the ASPX.cs or the C# page. So what we are going to do here is, we are going to create an event handler for the submit button. So if you see here, we have the submit button as a ASP button, and we need to write a event for this particular button. So I'm just going to click on this design part of it, or the design button, which will show us the entire the form that we created in a UI format or in a GUI format. So we will just double click on this button, and automatically Visual Studio should create one event handler function, which is the btn submit underscore click. So whenever we will be clicking on that particular submit button, this is the function that will be called. So this is a neat feature that Visual Studio has. You can just use this. So I'm just going to be taking up all the data that has been created or that has been captured in this particular form. So I'm just going to be starting with name, designation, organization, and go through all those variables. So we're just going to be creating some variables and accessing the data from this control. So my first variable is name, and I'm going to be capturing the value of txt name, that is my control name, and from that the value attribute actually will give the value that the user has entered. So it will have the name that user enters. So in the same way, I'm going to be accessing the, let's say, organization, and it has txt org dot value. So this is something I have. After that, the designation, let's just say it's called desig, and I'm going to be calling the txt desig dot value. After that, we have one variable called email, which will have the value of txt email. Then we also have the phone number, so it's called phone, and we named the control as txt phone dot value. And then we have our photo URL. The photo URL is actually the photo that the user enters as a URL for their profile pic or any photo that they want to display in their B card. So let's just say text URL dot value. So we pretty much have the values into separate variables which we required for our business card. The next step that we are going to be doing here is we are going to create the flow data or the flow data part or the flow data text that we discussed about. So let's just create another variable called flow data, and it will be a string value, and we are going to be creating a format as per that is what we discussed in our previous slides. Like we are going to be adding some sort of identifier over here. So let's just say we keep it as 366 PI B card or something, B card app or something. And after that, I'm going to be just putting down a hash, which will be my separator. And after that, I'm just going to append all these values as per the format that we decided. So for appending, you just need to add a plus sign after a string, and then you can just use the variable names to append those values. So the first thing that I'm going to append here is the name. After that, again, I'm going to append a hash value, which will be a static string. And after that, let's just append the organization, and let's just append after that again a hash. So I'm just going to copy this so that I don't need to type it again and again. After that organization, we have designation, then we have email ID, then we have the phone number, and let's just have at the end the photo URL. So a photo. Yep. So this is pretty much what our flow data will look like. So our flow data will actually have the identifier, which we have decided as 3665 B card app. And after that, we will have all the values that the user has entered using the form, and we will separate all those values using the hash separator. We are using this separator concept just because once we are fetching the data back from blockchain, we just have a clarity of which data is available where, and we can just easily split the entire string using the separator that we are using. So that is pretty much what it is required for. So let's just also do or define a few other variables like our API URL. So our API URL is needed to call that particular URL. We can also use these variables as a global variable or something, but I can use it in locally also because I'm not going to be using it in different functions. So it is pretty much fine if we define it over here also. So my API URL is something that I have opened here. So it is like, this is the base URL that I have. Currently it is hosted on localhost, so HTTP localhost and the port name and the SVC variable. and even if we want, we can just use the send to address URL or endpoint over here also, which is used to send transactions to blockchain. So we are going to be using that also, because in this particular page that we are creating, we are only going to be doing a send to address transaction. So this is my API URL that we will be hitting or posting our data to. The next thing that I am going to be doing here is I am going to be defining a flow address. So if you remember, in our previous class also, we discussed that the transactions that we will be doing to save this data to FLO blockchain, it will be actually a flow transaction. So any flow transaction or any cryptocurrency transaction that you do, it requires a source address and a destination address. The source address will be used from the wallet that I am currently using to send these transactions, so that is not a problem. But I need a destination address where I need to send these transactions. So what I have decided is I will be using one address from my wallet only, so that the sending address and the receiving address are both part of my wallet. So whatever transaction that I do, the amount that I transact, it will come back to my wallet only, and my balance will not depreciate a lot. The only thing that I will be spending is the amount of flow that is required for performing the transaction, or which is called the transaction fee. So that is a very minimal amount that is going to be spent. So that is something I am going to do. So I'm just going to go to my Flow wallet address, and I'm going to just copy this particular address that I have created for these sessions, and I'm going to be using this address as my destination address to perform all the transactions for this particular application. So once we have that, we have the flow data, which contains all the data that user entered. We have the API URL, we have the destination API destination address. So the next thing that I'm going to be doing here is I'm going to create an object. The object that we will be creating here is it will be the object for which we will be sending this particular send to address request to. So if you remember, in the API development that we did, we used all the APIs in form of get method, but the send to address was a post method, and we created a data class which was actually used to contain all the send to address requests that the user will send in form of a JSON. So this is pretty much the class that we can reuse in our application, because this is exactly the JSON or the object that we are going to be sending. So what I am going to do here is I'm just going to create one class file by right clicking on my project in the Solution Explorer, go to add and create a new item called class. I'm going to click on new item, and once the new item window opens, I'm just going to be clicking on the data under Visual C#, code under Visual C#, and in that we have the class, and I can just name it as anything. Let's just say data class or something. It will just be the name of the file. In this data class, I'm just going to be replacing this class that is already created with the class or the send to address request class that we created in our API. You can type it as is in this format also. It has a string variable for address, amount, comment to, subtract fee from amount, replaceable. So these are pretty much the parameters that are required for performing the send to address RPC call. So we just created this just to make our calls and handling the data a bit easier. So once we have the data class available, we are just going to be creating an object for that. For that, we just create an object for the send to address request, and let's just say the object name is request, or let's say it is called obj or something. And we are just going to create a new object for this send to address request. And after that, we are just going to be putting all the parameter values into that object. So we have obj.address, and that address will be this particular address that we defined. So it is the flow address value variable. After that, we have obj.amount. So the amount that we are going to be transacting, all these will be very minimal amount, so that our transaction fee are also lower. So I'm just going to be putting 0.001 flow for doing these transactions. After that, we have obj.comment. This is just a comment that your wallet stores, so you can just put anything. So let's just say B card app or something. And after that, there is another comment which is also stored in the wallet, which is the comment 2. So I'm just going to be putting the same comment over here, B card app. After that, we are going to be adding the conf target, the confirmation target. Let's just keep it as 1. And then obj dot estimate mode. The estimate mode will be unset. We are not going to be estimating any transaction fee at our end. It will be left to the network. Obj dot flow data, and this is the flow data value that we created. So we are going to be assigning that to this object. And after that, I think the final one is okay. There is a replaceable. We are not going to be making our transaction replaceable, so we are going to be saying here as false. And after that, obj dot subtract fee from amount. We do not want the fee to be deducted from this amount, so we are going to be putting this as false. So this is pretty much done. The object that needs to go to the API is done, but this object will not be pushed to the API as is in form of an object. It needs to be converted into a JSON string, and then it needs to be pushed to the API. So what we are going to be doing here is we are going to be leveraging a class in Visual C#, which is called Json Serializer. You may type it, but it may show that this is not available. So you just check whether that is the usings is available over here. If you see we don't have it, we need to actually import one reference class which is called system.web.script, and we're just going to be searching the assemblies for system.web. I'm going to be doing a system.web. We have the system.web. System.web.script. Okay, now finding that, let me just check that. Okay, system.web.extensions. We have that. We have the system.web.extensions. Okay, it's already referenced. So we should not have any problems with this. Yeah, we have this. Oh, I'm sorry. Typo error. Yep, so now it should be available. So if you see, we have this JavaScript serializer using system.web.script.serialization. We just import that into our usings, and we should have this reference available to our code. And once that is available, we are just going to be creating an object for this. Let's just call this object as Json Serializer or something. And we're just going to be creating that particular object. Once that is created, if you want to convert any C# object into JSON, you need to serialize that. So we are going to be storing the JSON file or the JSON or string into a variable called request.json, req.json, and we are going to be calling our Json Serializer object, and under that we are going to be calling the serialize method. Once you call the serialize method, you just need to pass in the object that you want converted to JSON. So this JSON Serializer.serialize, and then this object that we created over here, we're just passing it, and Json Serializer will serialize this object back to a JSON string. and we will have that in this request JSON. So once we have that, we are going to make the API call. To call an API, we require a few lines of code to actually do that part. If you are calling a get method, it is pretty much very easy and it can be done using probably 4 to 5 lines of code. But for doing a post method call, we require a few more parameters that need to go in. So what we are going to do here is we are just going to create a try catch block so that if there is some issue in our API calling, we can just capture that. So we are just going to be creating one try catch block over here and just catch and generalize exception over here. And if something comes up, we'll just put it into console so that we can just have a look at what the error is. And let's just say ext.toString or something. And we have this. So in this try block, what we are going to do here is we are going to be first creating an HTTP web request. So an HTTP web request is something that is used to make API calls or make different types of HTTP requests from C# code. So for that, this system.net package needs to be imported. If you see, I just clicked on the suggestions and it shows that using system.net. So once that is available, it goes to this import page banner over there, and we have this object over here. We just call this request, and once we have that, we just need to initialize this or create this object. So what we are going to be doing here is we are going to be creating a web request, and the web request, and we are going to be calling a create method, and with that we are going to be passing the URL for our API, which is in the API URL. But if you see, this is a web request and we need the request object in form of an HTTP web request. So what we are going to do here is we are going to cast this particular response to HTTP web request type, and we are going to be casting this particular web request into a HTTP web request format. And once we have that, we are just going to be setting a few options in this request, HTTP web request. For example, the first thing that we are going to do here is we are going to set the method, which will be post method, because the send to address API that we created, it's a post method. Then what we are going to do here is we are going to be setting the protocol version or the HTTP protocol version. The HTTP version that we are going to be using is I think we are using the .NET version 4.6.1, so it supports version 10 and 11. We should use the latest one, the version 11, the HTTP 1.1. After that, we have to set the request.content type, which will actually set the type of content that we are going to be sending as part of this request. So our type of data or the content type that we are sending is in form of JSON. The content is application/JSON. So this is the content type for JSON. After that, we are just going to be setting the content length. These are all part of the header information that go into this request. So after that, the content length needs to be set up. The content length is, our content is the flow, this request JSON. So req JSON dot length, it will give us the length for the entire data that is going to as part of the post. After that, we are going to be writing a stream writer object, which will actually write our data into the memory stream. So we just need to import for the stream the system.io .get request stream. .get request stream. So this will open a stream writer into our request object, and after that we are going to be converting our data, which is the request JSON, into a byte array. So we are just going to create a byte array, and then we are going to encode our data. We're going to be using the encoding class using system.txt, and we are going to be converting our data into UTF-8 format, which is for Unicode data. So UTF-8, and then we are going to be converting it into form of bytes, and the data that we have is the request JSON. So this request JSON string is first converted into a byte array, and that byte array will be returned to our stream, written to our request stream using the stream writer object that we created above, the WRI. So the WRI.write function will now be called, and this will write our entire byte array, which has the name array, and it will start with an offset. The offset will be 0 for the starting value, and the count will be our array length. So it needs to know what is the size of the array that is being written to the memory stream. So this is something that we do, and after that we are just going to be flushing our stream writer and cleaning all the data that is not required anymore. So we'll just call the write.flush, and after that we're just going to close this stream writer. So for that we write.close. Perfect. And after this we are just going to be calling the API using this entire configuration that we did, and we are going to be getting the response. So for doing the request, we have the HTTP web request class, and for fetching the response we have the HTTP web response. So the web response object, we are going to be naming it response, and will be equal to, it will actually be calling the request, and it will be calling the get response method from there. So get actually call the API and get the response from the API. But since it is not in form of HTTP web response, we need to cast the response back to HTTP web response. For that, we're just going to be typing HTTP web response in a bracket just before our request.get response line. Web response. So this will pretty much cast the response to HTTP web response object so that we can work on it. And once we have that, we can just check whether our response code is something which we want. Like for example, in HTTP, when any request has been successfully completed, it gives a 200 HTTP status code or a response code. If there is something, the URL that you are calling, it is not available, it will give you a HTTP 404 for not found. If you are getting some sort of a 500 series errors like 500 or 503, it means there is some issue with the server and the server is giving some exceptions. So we can just keep those details handy so that we can just have a look at it if some requirements come by for them. So let's just say we call this response code, and we need to cast the response code into integer. So we'll just cast this integer, and the actual data that is coming is HTTP web resp or the resp object resp.response.status code. So the status code will actually contain the HTTP status code or the response code, and we are just going to be converting that into integer by casting that into integer format and storing into this REST code. It is just currently in this particular demo we are not going to be using it, but if you require, you can just have a look at it and reference it, and if you want to perform any checks and any validations over there, you can do that. So after that, what we have done is we are going to do here is we are going to be creating a stream reader object. So this stream reader, what it will do is it will actually read the entire memory stream that has come in form of the response, and then it will create this stream reader, and after that we are just going to be accessing that stream reader and converting the data back to a result JSON or string format, which we can pretty much handle after that. So we are going to be creating a new stream reader, and we are going to passing the stream that we got. So that is the response dot get response stream. So this is the response stream that the API will be sending, and we also pretty much need to mention what is the type of data or the encoding type of that response. So we are going to be saying that it's encoding.utf8. encoding.utf8. So the data that we are getting back from API, it is also in form of UTF-8. If you remember, in the APIs also, we created this particular code wherein we mentioned that the outgoing response will be in form of JSON and the character set will be UTF-8. So that is why we are using this encoding type, so that we specifically tell our reader that the data that is coming, it is in form of UTF-8. So we are pretty much done, and now the last part is creating one response variable or something. Let's just create it outside the try catch block. Response or a rest string or something. Let's just keep it or initialize it with the empty string and use this particular variable, the resp string, to actually get the data that the API has returned. For that, we're just going to be calling the stream reader and read its entire data to the end. So for that, we have a method called read to end. So once we have that, we are pretty much done with the calling of the API, and these few lines, 10-12 lines of code is actually going to be calling this API URL that we mentioned here. It is going to be set, it is going to set the request JSON that we created over here using this object. It is going to push that using the post method in form of a JSON, and once the data comes back, it is going to convert that data back to string and store that into this resp string. So this response string or the resp string is actually the data that we are interested in. So as per our flow, what is going to be happening here is once we fill up the entire form and click the submit button, this entire transaction is going to be created, and once that transaction is going to be created, it is going to be pushed to the API. The API in turn will make the FLO blockchain transaction and return us with a transaction ID for that particular transaction. So this is the best case flow that we are doing. Let's just hope that it is working, and let's just check that. So we are going to just save this, and I'm just going to be putting a few breakpoints over here just to go along with the code run through and see what the data is coming and how it is working. So in the meantime, I'm just going to search for some image of me which is available publicly. So I'm just going to capture that over some social media pages that I have. You can use any URL for your profile pics, whichever you have in Facebook, Twitter, or LinkedIn. You can just go to your profile pics, right click on it, select open image in new tab, and you pretty much have the entire URL available in the browser window. So let's just wait for the application to get started. So once you do some code changes or the code behind changes, it typically takes a few seconds extra for Visual Studio to actually start this, because it is compiling those codes at the back end, and once the compilation is complete, it will just start with the application. So let's just wait for a few more seconds for that to happen. Okay, so we have that, and what we are going to do here is we are just going to be filling up this form. Let's just put the name. I'm just putting my name over here. I'm just going to put the designation or something, organization, email ID, and the phone number, I'm just going to put a random phone number over here. And photo URL, you can just get your photo or image from any of your publicly available URLs that you have, and you can use that. I'm going to be using my LinkedIn profile pic URL. I'm just copying it in another screen, and I'm just going to be putting that over here. And this is pretty much the URL that I have, and I'm going to be clicking the submit button now. So let's just see what happens when we click on the submit button. So typically what should happen is it should hit the submit button, and this yellow colored highlighted code is being shown. It means that our organization has not is okay, if is okay, and the photo URL is pretty much also there. So after we have this over here, we can just use this button, the step over button, to click it and move the code one step at a time. Let's just move this one step at a time and see what data gets created. So in the flow data, if you see, we have created this particular over using the protocol that we defined. So this is the identifier that I'm using, the 360 B card app. After that, my name, my organization name, email ID, phone number, and then the photo URL. So this is pretty much in line to what we decided we will be creating the data in form of. So let's just move ahead and step over the code and see how the created. So if you see, the object is getting created, and once we let's just move ahead and see what the code actually is doing. So we just stopped over here wherein we were making the API calls, and in this particular line, the HTTP web response, we are going to be calling the request object and pushing the data to the API URL that we got, and we should get the response from the API in form of a response object. So let's just step over this particular line of code, and it should take a few more seconds and it should go. So if you see, we got some exception. We can just see whether this can happen. So if you see, we stopped this particular operation for a few seconds, and therefore the operation has timed out, because the request object, once it gets created, it needs to complete in a few in a timeout period that it has been defined with. So we have surpassed that, and that's why this particular exception occurred. So we pretty much have that because of the session delay that we just got. So we are just going to be continuing this again, and we are going to be submitting this button again. And let's just move ahead with the entire piece of code again, and let's just go to that response line again. So I'm just going to put a debug point over here and click on continue. And once we have this, let's just step over this line, and if you see, this time it got successfully called. And if we see the response code line, it is a response code of 200. So as I said, HTTP response code 200 means that the particular API call has been success. So we have the response in the stream reader, and after the stream reader, we are just going to read it to end and store the response string to this response string variable. So if we see this particular response string variables data, you see we have the result JSON, and under that we have this particular alphanumeric value, which is actually the transaction ID. So if we just copy this transaction ID and go to the FLO Blockchain Explorer of testnet, because we are doing these transactions on testnet. If you remember, the testnet blockchain explorer is testnet.flowchain.in, and if we just go there and copy paste this particular transaction ID, we should pretty much see that transaction over in the blockchain explorer. So if that is available in the blockchain explorer, it pretty much means that our transaction has happened in the blockchain. So let's just wait for this particular blockchain. Let's just open another one also. It's testnet dot I think the flowchart.in is down or something. Florinecoin.info is also an explorer that we have. So it is opening. Let's just see whether the transaction got through or not. I can pretty much see that on my wallet, that transaction has happened. If you see, I can see in my transactions that this particular transaction with the flow data, this particular flow data with 3665P card app with my entire data, and it has gotten through. So this is available in my transaction section of my wallet, but I just need to make sure that it is available in the blockchain explorer also. So let's just go and do a quick search over here. I'm not pretty sure if it will show up in this particular testnet explorer, because this is a very old explorer that is currently not being supported by the community. The testnet.flowchart.in is the one that is being supported, but it seems that this is somehow down right now. So let's just try it again. Or let's just open the flowchart.in and see if that opens, and then go to the testnet explorer from there. It seems that the flowchart.in URL is somehow down. But if you see, this is pretty much the transaction ID that is returned by the blockchain. So once we did the transaction, this is the transaction ID that we got, and we will pretty much get the details of these transaction ID from our own APIs. If you remember, we created some of the APIs for this, like the get transaction and the get raw transaction. If we pass this to our APIs, we should also be getting that. So if you want, we can also see that over here using our own APIs. It's 63262, localhost colon 63262, and the API name is service1.svc. So this is our API. So let's just call the get transaction or the get raw transaction, and pass in the transaction ID that we got, and we should get the transaction details from the FLO blockchain. If you see, we have the entire FLO blockchain data available over here. So this is what we are going to be doing or completing in our next session. We will be using this transaction ID that we got in this particular REST string variable, and we are going to be calling our APIs, and we are then going to be setting this entire data that the blockchain has into a small sort of a business card like UI, and show the image from the image URL and populate the data from the blockchain. So that is something that we plan on doing in the next session. For this particular session, I'm afraid we have this only. So let's just move ahead. And I hope that this particular session was informative and helpful for you all. And as always, we will be happy to receive any suggestions, feedback, or questions regarding the sessions and topics in our email ID mentioned on the screen. It's abhijit@366fitech.com. We would request you to subscribe and like our YouTube channel and join us on Telegram. Also, please spread the word about SkyPiCast and the session so that we can reach more of you. Thanks and goodbye, and see you in the next session.